justice are not owned as principles by all men, etc. Moral rules need a proof, ergo they're not innate. Instance, I'm just glancing through this to give you an idea where he goes. Conscience will be urged as checking us for such breaches, etc. Okay. But so let me go back to here so that okay, let's start here. So idea is the object of thinking, every man being conscious to himself that he thinks, etc. How he comes by them, how he comes by these ideas, materials of reason and knowledge, the objects of sensation, one source of ideas. First, our senses. We get ideas of colors and so on. We've seen this happen before, not only with Aristotle, but with Descartes. And by the way, it'll keep going. We'll see Berkeley talking about it, Hume talking about it, etc. And then, so we have internal sense, and I call this reflection, that you can not only experience something, but you know that you're experiencing something. And I would suspect that we're all in agreement with that. Not only do you say, oh, this is a nice hat, but you know that you thought to yourself, hey, this is a nice hat. So you have this kind of reflection. And notice, by the way, that that's not something that comes from an external sense. That's some sort of internal reflection that happens, right? It's observable in children. He that attentively considers the state of a child at his first coming into the world will have little reason to think him stored with plenty of ideas. I mean, some of you have been a child yourself, I think, yes? So you've probably, think of all the things you remembered, when you first, this milk is a little bitter today. I don't know. Did you think that? You remember thinking that? No? That should be funny. Okay? Never use that joke ever again. It wasn't funny. I don't know. My first memory was putzing about on a beige carpet. And I didn't know it was beige. I can remember the carpet and the ply of the carpet. And I remember looking up at the couch, and my mom and dad were sitting, my dad on the right side, my mom on the left side, and in the middle was the TV installer who had just installed our first TV. Big box. And the installation required him putting a hole through the wall and taking this wire up to a antenna that he installed on the roof. That's how you get your reception, right? And the wire was sitting there on the floor, with the two little hooks, because he hadn't attached it to the TV yet. And I'm on the floor, and I see this, and I pick it up, and I think, this goes in here. And I stuck it in the electric socket, which is not where it goes, by the way. And as a result, I was doing this on the floor. I was being electrocuted, actually. And I'm like this, and all of a sudden, thank you, the installer saw me. My parents totally oblivious to me, but the installer saw me, and he reached down, and that's the end of that memory. He saved me, obviously. Pulled me away from the electric wire, where I was electrocuting myself. By the way, I've been a philosophy major ever since that occasion. Knew there had to be a joke at the end of that. But that's a real experience that I really remember. But I don't know how far back it goes. I don't know if I was very linguistic yet at all. I don't think so. When do you start learning the words and start being able to say them? You probably hear them and understand them first, but I love the idea of teaching infants sign language. Yes? Have you heard of this technique? Probably everyone now, because I think it really grew in popularity, and I think the hospital teaches women to use signs so that they can talk to the child, and the child actually can sign back, because that for some reason is hungry, or somehow they learn sign language now before they learn oral communication. So that's pretty impressive. But as far as Locke is concerned, that's where we're first learning and becoming verbal, and we're associating the words that we speak with the things that we're experiencing. Eraser. At least in English, right? I don't know what it is in any other language, because I've never looked it up in Russian or French or German. I don't know what it is. But it's an eraser in English.
In German, it probably has Zeuge after it.
It's probably about blackboard chalk remover thing.
Well, like a tool.
So that it's like
like a Werkzeug. So it's like it's a working thing, like a medieval tool. It's like Zeuge is thing, and then like it's like a working thing. It's probably a very literal word for eraser, or it's not. It doesn't have Zeuge in it. Gummy.
Oh, you know what? That's the wrong kind, though. That's a pencil eraser. Gummy is rubber, so. Oh well. I mean, that's not a big thing. But you get the idea. We're learning words and we put them together. There's all kinds of fascinating things about that. Apparently, as infants, we're able to hear sounds from all kinds of different human languages. But if you don't hear them, some of those abilities go away. So if you're raising a child that you want to be polylingual, make sure that you get speakers of the other languages to speak to the child while it's young enough and early enough that it will hear the sounds of that language, like the tones in Chinese, for example, that if you don't hear it when you're young enough, apparently it's very difficult to learn as an adult. Your ears don't pick them up. But so he goes on talking about that. And so the idea, of course, is that we end up then with simple ideas that relate to simple sense experiences. I'll have to tell you this interesting story. Gilbert Ryle was on a train with Bertrand Russell, and they were trying to think of things to talk about. And Gilbert Ryle asked Bertrand Russell, "Why do you think John Locke has been so influential a philosopher?" And Bertrand Russell thought a minute, and he said, "Well, because John Locke invented common sense, and only the British have had it ever since." That's as close as I can get to an actual quote from Bertrand Russell from that train ride experience, which was relayed to me through Daniel Dennett in his book I've Been Thinking, which I've been reading lately, and that's where I picked that up. But what's with the common sense? Remember, Aristotle thought that all of the sense input that we have, our eyes, our ears, our nose, all that stuff, all recognizes that a particular thing is a united thing. So I see it, hear it, I don't want to taste it, but you get the idea. They're all somehow united in my knowledge, and I'm not pointing to the brain because I don't think Aristotle thought our knowledge was in the brain. I think he thought it was in the heart. But in any case, for Aristotle, what united all of those senses was a common sense. So some organ that we have that put all of those incoming senses together to unify them and say, this is the unification of all of those experiences, right? But for anyone who's an Aristotelian, and obviously David Hume, Thomas Hobbes is an Aristotelian, so is John Locke, because he's reading the same stuff. Sense that this is so Aristotelian in nature. that it's building, but nonetheless it's still Aristotelian in basic idea, that there is such a common sense. But also I would argue that John Locke's philosophy is essentially the common sense philosophy that we have today as common people in a society that are aware of John Locke's philosophy, that we think in those terms today, right? And how do I mean that? Well, when it comes to our sensing things, what Locke introduces is that our senses observe the secondary. Am I going the right way? No. I always have trouble with. There it is. So secondary qualities. These are our secondary qualities. The things have secondary qualities. These are original qualities that are produced in us. And that is that our senses interpret the world. Our senses are interpreting the things. And so what's going into our minds as that thing is not the thing itself, but the thing as interpreted by that sense, or that group of senses. Right? So what we're seeing is the secondary qualities. But I think we all kind of accept this. We referred to this as your perspective on the thing, the way it appears to you. So we know that the light will change the appearance of things. We know that our state of mind will change the nature of the way we perceive things. We know that our language, well, I'm skipping way ahead here, but we know that our language frames the way we view the world. It's way ahead, actually. We're not there yet. We're building in that direction, right? But at this point, what Locke is pointing out is that we're not actually seeing the object as it is, although he goes on to point out that there are primary qualities. I still have that up there. So there are primary qualities of bodies, right? As far as he knows, right? Now these are things like its solidity, its extension, that it's moving or it's in a state of rest, how many of the figure, it's rectangular, etc., right? These are inseparable from it. So an object has characteristics, says Locke, the primary characters of it that I, know must be the case, even though my senses are incapable of actually giving me those. I'm somehow aware that those primary characteristics must exist, those primary qualities exist, but I'm not actually able to see them per se, because all I can do is sense it with my human senses. I know, for example, today that snakes see things with different kinds of vision. Eagles see things differently than our eyes do it. We're limited to a certain range of light waves, whereas we don't see ultraviolet or red. What's ultra red? No. Ultraviolet is the one end, and what's the other one? Infrared. Thank you. So we know our eyes are limited as human beings. So what we're seeing is visually what a human will look at, not necessarily a snake or a rabbit, or someone with a different culture sees colors differently. Remember, I think we talked about that already right at the very beginning. And by the way, this is going to be a real tricky point for him. And the problem is, and this is where the British empiricist problem begins, and that is, well, if all our awareness of an object or group of objects or everything in our experience is limited by our human senses and the way our human qualities interpret those things, how do we know what those things are like in themselves, the way they really are? Now, I would argue that that's a mistaken question, but because if we're thinking in terms of the model-dependent realism that we have played with, remember Stephen Hawking? We have models of the way the world is, and within that model, that's the way we think things are real, on that model, right? But to say that there's outside of all models the way that the world really is, that's actually totally a misnomer, because there would be no such way the world is without you're putting it into a conceptual model. And those are human-based, and dependent on what kind of models we've created for ourselves, and not something that is like, that's the way the world really is. Well, we can't get there. And so the British empiricist problem is exactly this. Given how things appear to us, how do we know the way they really are? Because we can't tell, right? And since he's arguing that there are primary qualities that are out there, they're going to trounce him and say, how do you know? How do you know something has primary qualities? And as we'll see when we talk with, when we read George Berkeley, that becomes a contradiction. And that's where it gets into Locke's materialism. And in fact, that's my quiz question for today, I believe, right? And the second quiz question, so that would be today's quiz question, is, what do you think of Locke's materialism? What do you think of Locke's materialism? Basically, he argues that everything consists of atoms, and that's what creates substances. And atoms are independent little beings that bounce around and join one another. He thinks they have different shapes and so on, and so they like interlock with one another sometimes and so on. And as a result, what we have is a material world created by God, like a clock, and continuing to tick on and on and on and on, independently of God's constantly fixing something here, accepting your prayers here, denying your prayers here, punishing you here. You know, for Locke, the universe basically is a material thing that's running on its own, independently of the constant attentions of a deity. And so, even though he is a deist, and by the way, folks like Thomas Jefferson and I think John Adams are Unitarians at the time. Unitarians instead of Trinitarians. Remember, Trinity is a belief that there's God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. Jefferson believes there's a God, but if you're interested, Jefferson rewrote the New Testament, and it's online, so you could look at it. And he called it The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. He was convinced that Jesus was a man, that was a very good teacher, had great morals, taught them, unfortunately died on the cross, etc. He put this together, as you can see, from Gospels in Greek, Latin, French, and English. And he put them all together in his interpretation of them. And he only kept the things he believed could have happened. He threw out all the miracles and stuff. By the way, lots of different people have taken their oath of office into Congress and so on, on this Jefferson Bible. So when they get to pick their own book, and some have even picked the Quran recently, right? But there are folks that, which Bibles will you do you want to, take your official swearing in? They have picked this Bible by Thomas Jefferson. And in fact, I know that because the introduction to my copy of it, I have a paper copy of it at home, and the introduction was written by Frank Church, who was the son of Senator Church, who took his oath on that, not that copy, obviously, because it hadn't been published yet, but on, I think, the original copy of Jefferson's book. So that's kind of interesting, too. But so, and so Jefferson and others were referred to as American deists. And that's kind of interesting because when you think, what is an American deist? I don't know what the S. Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, and Monroe. So many of them. American deists? Is that a... Whoops. Well, that's not really what I wanted. But basically, the difference between a deist and a theist. A theist believes in God, but believes that God interacts with us, so that you can pray to God and God listens and gives you wisdom and so on. A deist believes in a creator God that created the universe, but it's ridiculous to think you can interact with God. It's like the algorithm that runs the universe. So, you get the idea. I mean, if you take the ontological argument to that extent, that's not the kind of God that's being defined. That means that I can pray to God and have some kind of interaction with God and so on. So that's a weird looking page. List of deism in the Founding Fathers, etc. So it looks like there's plenty of, I don't know what all that entails. So the problem of materialism, though, is that if you believe that the universe is kind of a physical thing that's been created by the deist or by the deity, right, and no longer has to fix it. In fact, for Locke, it's an insult to God to think that the creation needs his help constantly. What kind of perfect, all-powerful, all-creator God would create a universe that constantly needs his resetting the weights on the cuckoo clock every day, or has to push things, to make them work, or interact with people? That's a denial of the perfection of God that made things exactly the way God wanted them to be right from the beginning. So for Locke, that's an insult to the conception of God, to think there's a constant interaction between God and people and creatures and so on. Is this all fun? Now, the issue that we'll see when we move on, I believe our next person okay. So we do have break right now, starting this weekend. I have that correctly, right? Where am I here? Yes, okay. So March 11th through March 15th, I think my dates are right. It's spring break, so there's no classes. I don't believe UAA is closed, though, so if you want to come and study and things, that's still fine. And so next class we'll talk about Leibniz and his monadology. Remember, they're contemporaries.